Hey, AP Environmental Science, it's me, Mrs. Willis, and I'm here to talk to you about indoor air pollutants and specifically the most common ones that you're going to come across not only in your household but on that AP test. So let's dive in and get started. As you probably know, smoking is extremely toxic and extremely bad for your health. I mean, look at all of these chemicals that are found in a cigarette. So anytime you smoke indoors, these chemicals are released into the atmosphere and can be inhaled and absorbed by other people in the room. So things like carbon monoxide and benzene and nicotine, these are all chemicals released by indoor smoking. And so my advice is obviously to not do this and to stay away, especially if someone is smoking inside, because you can be exposed to all these different chemicals. And if you don't believe me that smoking is extremely bad for your health, just take a look at all of these different problems that are caused and linked from cigarette smoking. And of course, if you smoke more than 2 packs a day, it increases your chances of getting lung cancer and larynx cancer, emphysema, and coronary heart disease by a tremendous amount. So again, my advice, stay away and you won't get exposed to all these chemicals from indoor smoking. A second chemical that you probably didn't know that can be found in inside environments is the element radon. Radon is technically not an anthropogenic source, meaning this is not coming from humans. So sometimes what people do is they build their houses obviously on rock, and they don't realize that rock is actually composed of uranium-238. And so if they build their house on this rock, that uranium-238 will decay and it creates this colorless, odorless gas called radon that enters into the house. How does it get into the house? Well, of course, there's pores and things like that in the soil. There's also pores and stuff in the foundations, and there's cracks and things like that where those gases can travel and come up through the foundations of your house. What does radon do to you? Well, it is a carcinogen. So that means this is a chemical that is known to cause cancer. In fact, it is the second most common cause of lung cancer in the world, second to smoking. And what's really neat is that you can get these test kits that will test to see, do you have high levels of radon in your house? And they're relatively inexpensive. If you're wondering if you live in an area that contains a lot of uranium-238, well, this is basically a geology thing. So you have to know something about the rocks and where they're located. So if you take a look at this map, any area that is colored in red, that's a zone 1 for radon. So that means it has high levels of uranium-238 in the ground. Anything that's colored yellow is zone 3. So that means it's low. Low levels of uranium-238 are found in that area. So how do you get rid of the radon? Well, you have to do some things with your house to be able to suction out that gas. So sometimes people do install suction systems or vacuums that are underneath the house that can actually pull the gas away from entering into the house. Other options involve sealing the cracks in the foundations of your house. So that way the gas, it's a little bit difficult for it to travel through into your house. And then lastly, you can increase the ventilation in your house. Now, obviously, this is not possible for areas that are extremely cold or extremely warm, but if you do create the flow of air in your house, then you won't get an accumulation of radon gas in your house. Our third indoor air pollutant may look a little familiar. Have you ever seen something like this that you see in the picture? Well, if you have definitely seen mold. And mold is a fungus that loves to eat away at organic material. So our houses, our buildings, they're pretty much made of organic material. They're made of things like wood and cardboard and drywall. And so mold has an easy time to go ahead and eat away at the material. How does mold spread? Well, it's very common fungus, and it releases spores into the air that will drop into areas and try to grow. And if the conditions are great for that mold, which means there's moisture and obviously material for it to thrive on, then of course it will grow. Now, mold can be pretty bad for human health as well. It can trigger a lot of immune responses. So people tend to get allergies when they're inhaling mold spores. Sometimes those mold spores can create lesions on your lungs. And then also, I think one of the most common things when people are exposed to mold a lot, they tend to get very nauseous and vomit. Our fourth indoor air pollutant that we're going to talk about is asbestos. Now, asbestos is a natural mineral and it is mined and used in our buildings and industry. And the reason why it was used is because it is really an inert mineral, meaning it doesn't burn, it doesn't conduct heat or conduct electricity. So you can put it in areas that are likely to burn or likely to have electrical impulses, and it won't allow for those things to burn or pass on electricity. So we use this in a lot of things in the past. Electrical insulation, roofing. At my old school, it was in the carpeting of the building. And the reason they put that there is because those could be flammable hazards, right? And so if you put asbestos down there, it reduces the fire risk. It's also found in car brakes. So, car brakes, in order to slow down your car, there's a lot of friction, and that friction creates heat. So if you put asbestos there, it reduces the heat amount in that area. Well, we found out that it's not so great for human health, and in 1986, the Asbestos Hazard and Emergency Control Act was actually passed to require all asbestos use pretty much be phased out by 1997. If you look at asbestos underneath a microscope, you'll see this. I mean, it's very fine, sharp fibers of this mineral. And why this is the problem is if you inhale these fibers, they pretty much inject themselves, they kind of stick themselves right in your lungs. And so then your lungs go to attack it, it starts an immune response, and what it leads to is scarring of that area because you're trying to remove these fibers, but they don't go anywhere. They don't get broken down. They stay there in your lungs. And so eventually over time, if you keep getting exposed to this asbestos, your lungs become scar tissue. And so the lungs lose their elasticity and their function, and it makes it really difficult to breathe. When asbestos is found in a building, it needs to be removed at this point because we do know it's very harmful for humans if they inhale it. So you can see here in these pictures, a lot of times when asbestos is removed, you have to send in a hazardous materials team or hazmat team. They are wearing the very specialized suits so that they don't themselves get exposed to these asbestos fibers. Now, asbestos in its plain form is fine. It's when you agitate or you move it, that's when those fibers can break off and they can be inhaled. And here is another picture of someone removing asbestos from the walling of a building. Two human health effects that are caused from asbestos. One is called mesothelioma, and this is pretty much lung cancer when it's caused by asbestos. And so if you inhale high concentrations of asbestos, those silica fibers get lodged into your lung and it causes that cancer. The second one is called asbestosis, and this is when acid tries to eat away at the fiber. And that's what I was kind of talking about in the last slides there, that that fiber, it's not broken down, and so it causes a scarring of the lung tissues. Our next indoor air pollutant is something called formaldehyde. Now, if you are in a science classroom, you might be familiar with this chemical because it's often used to preserve animals. So if you've ever seen animals in a jar, they're dead, they tend to be preserved in formaldehyde. Now, why is it used and why do we have this inside? Well, it's actually a pretty good fungicide, so it kills off funguses, and a disinfectant. So it can be used to kill germs, bacteria, things like that. It's also used in a lot of building materials, so pressed wood such as particle board or other types of plywood. They may have formaldehyde that is inside of them. Also glues and adhesives that are used in building materials, and also insulation can be found to contain this material. Now you might be asking yourself, well, it's not that bad, right? If it's found inside the wood, but the problem is these materials inside the house, they actually decay over time. And as they decay, they release that formaldehyde into the atmosphere inside your home. Newer houses will tend to have higher concentrations of formaldehyde, and that is because newer houses contain a lot of those new construction materials, new plywood, pressed wood, glues, adhesives. So as they decay, it will release into that air. So it's very common in houses. What does it do to humans? Well, when you inhale it, it does cause things like watery eyes, headaches, and difficulty breathing. And formaldehyde can be a carcinogen, so that means it can cause cancer. A medical condition that actually exists is called sick building syndrome. So sick building syndrome is created when there are too many indoor air pollutants that are accumulating inside a building. And of course, it's causing people to become sick. So if people are complaining about dizziness or headaches, rash, fever, tiredness, it could be caused because they're inhaling too many indoor air pollutants. Newer buildings, especially newer office buildings, tend to have sick building syndrome more because they're composed of these newer construction materials that are gassing and releasing these indoor gases inside. And also, a lot of these newer office buildings, they don't have outside ventilation. So there's no way to like open windows, especially if you're in these big skyscraper buildings. You can't open a window and just let some fresh air in. So they tend to be all contained in these systems. How will you know a lot of people are getting sick? Well, you can definitely see that people are calling in sick, so they're absent from their jobs or their school sites, and it leads to a loss of productivity. But ultimately, if many people in the building are complaining of these same symptoms, it could be because there are too many indoor air pollutants. And lastly, let's talk about OSHA, because OSHA was created to protect people in these buildings so they wouldn't get exposed to things like sick building. So OSHA stands for Occupational Safety and Health Act. It was created in 1970, and it's a government agency that protects employees. So if employees feel like they're at risk, whether that be exposure to toxic chemicals, excessive noise, or just dangerous conditions, they can report their working environment to OSHA, and OSHA will come in and do an inspection to try to correct those issues. So ultimately, the employees feel like they can work in a safe and healthy environment. All right, everyone, that concludes indoor air pollutants. I hope that was extremely good. I'll talk to you later.